By the late 1940s, one of the most brilliant minds in American audio was quietly losing control of everything he had built. His name? James B. Lansing. It's a name that's etched into arguably two of the most influential audio companies ever created, Altec Lansing and JBL. But while those three letters, JBL, would become a global symbol of power and precision, the man behind them lived a life defined by brilliance, conflict, and a growing sense of defeat. Lansing didn't just build speakers. He engineered the sound of the 20th century. He was also a man caught between two worlds, the uncompromising instincts of an artist and the cold realities of American business. In this episode, we're tracing the rise and fall of a visionary who reshaped how the world hears, while fighting battles inside and outside the corporations that bore his name. Tragic genius, the man who put the L in Altec on this edition of DynastyVinyl. Before the logos, before the corporate battles, before the three letters JBL would shake concert halls and living rooms around the world, there was James Martini. Most of you know him as James B. Lansing. It's a name he legally adopted. As a young man, he had an obsession with sound. In the early decades of the 20th century, audio was still a crude science. Loudspeakers were little more than mechanical noisemakers, devices designed to be heard, not necessarily enjoyed. But Lansing heard something that others didn't. Where most engineers chased volume, he chased clarity. Where manufacturers looked for cheaper parts, he searched for better physics. To Lansing, sound reproduction wasn't a manufacturing problem, it was an acoustic puzzle, and his standards were absolute. Relocating to sunny California, working alongside family members and future business partners, Lansing began designing drivers that were radically more efficient than anything on the market. His systems could fill large spaces with powerful, articulate sound without distortion swallowing the music. And Hollywood noticed. In 1927, the world was suddenly, violently loud. The Jazz Singer had just premiered, and Hollywood was in a blind panic. As motion pictures evolved from silent films into talkies, theaters suddenly needed sound systems capable of filling massive rooms with clear dialogue and sweeping orchestral scores. Side note here, I feel I need to add a little context to this moment in history that I think is just too vital to skip. Lansing's genius was real. However, he was operating within a rigged game. For years, the big three, Western Electric, RCA, and Westinghouse, had a stranglehold on every movie theater in America, and they used ironclad leases to keep competitors out. Even if you had a better speaker, you couldn't get through the front door. That all changed in 1932 with the Consent Decree. It forced these giants to divest. Basically, they had to break up and sell off pieces of their empire to allow for a free market. Altec, All Technical Services, was created, and it now owned the rights to service all of those theaters. The problem was, they didn't actually make anything. And that's when Lansing's pursuit of sound stopped being a hobby and started becoming the future of American cinema. Through this opening in the market, Lansing's work began shaping the soundscape of an entire industry. The theaters that defined Hollywood's golden age were powered by systems built around his engineering. But success in engineering doesn't always translate into business, and the next decision Lansing made would change everything. Because in 1941, James B. Lansing didn't just sell a company, he sold his name. Disaster struck the Lansing Manufacturing Company in the fall of 1939. Ken Decker, Lansing's business partner and financial guru, was killed in a plane he was piloting. The business side of the operation began to suffer almost immediately. Orders were inconsistent, and debts were mounting. Lansing recognized the audio industry was just getting started, and that it was naturally becoming increasingly more corporate. So in 1941, he made a deal. His loudspeaker manufacturing operation would be absorbed by Altec, and on paper, they would be Altec Lansing. To Lansing, the decision seemed practical, even necessary. It meant stability, capital, and a global audience. The agreement, however, carried a hidden cost. The name Lansing no longer belonged to the man who crafted it. It belonged to the corporation. At first, the partnership bore incredible fruit. In 1944, Lansing created what many engineers still consider one of the most important loudspeakers ever built. The Altec Lansing 604 Duplex Loudspeaker. It placed two drivers into a single coaxial design that could reproduce music with an accuracy studios had never heard before. Recording engineers were stunned. Hollywood scoring stages adopted it almost overnight. For Lansing, it was proof that the sound he imagined in his head could finally exist in the real world. And for a brief moment, it seemed like Lansing had finally won. However, inside the boardroom, a very different conversation was already unfolding. Executives looked at production costs, sales forecasts, and manufacturing efficiency. Lansing looked at distortion curves, magnet structures, and acoustic loading. To him, sound reproduction was still a craft, something to be refined endlessly in pursuit of perfection. To the corporation, it was a product line. The friction was inevitable. Each design review became a negotiation. Each improvement Lansing proposed raised new questions for management. Was it necessary? Would customers notice? Would it increase unit cost? For a man whose identity was tied to the purity of sound, those questions felt less like business decisions and more like compromises to his integrity. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Lansing found himself trapped inside the very company built on his ideas. The 604 Duplex became the industry's gold standard. But for Lansing, it also became a symbol of something else. A masterpiece, built in a cage. Eventually, the tension became too much to ignore. Lansing soon realized if he wanted to reclaim control of his vision, he would have to do something bold. He would have to start over, again. By the mid-1940s, the tension had become impossible to ignore. James B. Lansing had helped build the foundation of Altec Lansing. His designs powered Hollywood theaters, and his speakers had become the reference point for studio engineers across the country. And yet, in the company, he was no longer fully in control of his vision. For a man as fiercely independent as Lansing, that reality was unbearable. So, in 1946, after honoring his 5-year no-compete clause with the company he helped to create, he made a decision that shocked much of the industry. He walked away. With little more than his reputation and a handful of loyal collaborators, Lansing founded a new company, James B. Lansing Sound Incorporated, JBL for short. This was not just a brand, it was a declaration. At first, Lansing wanted to call his new company Lansing Sound Incorporated. He was served with a cease and desist order from Altec. This is when Lansing learned he no longer had control of his name. In defiance, if Altec represented the system he could no longer control, JBL would become something very different. An engineering laboratory driven entirely by Lansing's uncompromising standards. Here, there would be no committees debating whether the pursuit of better sound was worth the cost. There would only be the question Lansing cared about most. Does it sound better? The early years were difficult. Money was tight, production was modest, and the future was uncertain. But creatively, Lansing was alive again. Freed from corporate constraints, he began designing new loudspeakers that pushed efficiency, power handling, and clarity even further. His drivers quickly found their way into cinemas, recording studios, and professional sound systems that demanded something louder, cleaner, and more dynamic than ever before. Engineers started to take notice. Slowly, the little company Lansing had built in defiance began to gain momentum. JBL wasn't just competing with Altec, it was challenging the entire industry. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Lansing had done the impossible. He had reclaimed his name, he had rebuilt his independence, and he had proven that his vision of sound still mattered. But the very force that drove Lansing's genius, his relentless pursuit of perfection, was about to demand a far heavier price. For a time, the gamble seemed to work, but building a company around brilliance comes with a hidden danger. Everything begins to depend on that one mind. Lansing wasn't just the founder of JBL, he was the chief engineer, the problem solver, the man everyone turned to when something needed to be better. And for Lansing, better was never optional. It was the only acceptable outcome. If a magnet structure could be better, he redesigned it. If a cone could respond faster, he rebuilt it. If a cabinet could project sound more efficiently, he started again from scratch. Each improvement didn't just make the speakers better, they made them extraordinary. But each improvement also made the company more fragile, because while Lansing was chasing perfection, someone still had to chase the numbers. Payroll, production schedules, debt. Those responsibilities never came naturally to Lansing. He had always relied on his business partners. People like his late business partner Ken Decker, a man who understood Lansing's brilliant mind for sound waves and physics, was lost in the world of finance. To Lansing, money was simply the fuel required to keep engineering moving forward. But to lenders and investors, the math had to balance. Slowly, the pressure began to close in. Bills mounted, credit tightened, and the expectations attached to the name James B. Lansing grew heavier. Friends and colleagues began to notice the toll it was taking. The man who once attacked engineering problems with restless energy was becoming quieter, more withdrawn, weighed down by the constant strain of keeping his company alive. There was a cruel irony in it. The very name Lansing had fought so hard to reclaim was now becoming a burden he felt he could no longer carry. And for a man whose identity was inseparable from his work, that feeling was devastating. When Lansing looked at the company he had built, he didn't see the beginning of a new dynasty. What he saw was a man falling short of his own impossible standards. By the late 1940s, the pressure surrounding Lansing had become relentless. Running JBL demanded more than engineering brilliance. It required financial discipline, stability, and a tolerance for compromise. Things Lansing had struggled with his entire career. In September of 1949, that weight became too much to bear. James B. Lansing took his own life. He was just 47 years old, and in his final moments, he believed that his life's work had fallen short. But history had other plans, because the technologies Lansing created, both at Altec Lansing and at JBL, didn't disappear with him. They multiplied. The loudspeakers he designed became the backbone of Hollywood cinema sound. Recording studios used them, relied on them to shape the albums that defined entire generations. Concert halls, broadcast studios, and audiophile listening rooms all carried the unmistakable fingerprints of his engineering. What Lansing saw as failure, the audiophile world would eventually recognize as its foundation. Today, the names Altec Lansing and JBL remain among the most influential in the history of audio. Entire industries were built upon the ideas he pioneered. The irony is impossible to ignore. James B. Lansing spent his life chasing perfect sound, often at the cost of his own peace of mind. For him, the pursuit was relentless. For the rest of us, it changed how the modern world sounds. If you like this content, check out some of my other videos in my hi-fi playlist. Until next time, I'm Ling Dynasty for Dynasty Vinyl. Thanks for watching.